All right, this is Gateway PI meeting for May 5. And Harry, it looks like you're up first.
Is the leaf blower running in the background
There is a significant amount of background noise, unfortunately. Uh,
Maybe why don't you go ahead and hopefully this
yeah,
stops.
sounds good. All right. They always have the worst timing. Um, yeah, so I think the next step for me then would be meeting times. Uh, I'd thrown around a straw poll. We discussed this on our last meeting as well. Right now, the leading times, I'm using Pacific for these times, but convert if you can to your own time zone. Our Mondays at 3, that gives us 8 people with a yes. And then Tuesdays at 10 give us less, but it gives us kind of the ability for everyone who's responded to attend at least one of these times. So instead of just a subset of maintainers or contributors, we might be able to get everyone attending some of these meetings. So I'm tempted to go back to trying this kind of rotation between 2 times. And I'm interested in starting as early as next week, but I wanted to run that by everyone here, see if this kind of rotation would work or would be distracting or whatever it might be. Any strong feelings on this? Got a thumbs up and looks fine, I think. So I suggested starting with the afternoon time first, afternoon Pacific time. That's APAC friendly and had a few more people that could attend. And so we can start there and then move on as we go. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I'll send out, it takes a while to get updated docs, updated infra, updated everything. But I think this will be good. So I'll work on that. And do let me know if you'd rather not switch to this, but so far it seems fine. Harry, is now a good time to come back to you, or should I keep on running?
Let's see, I switched the microphone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, this is perfect.
Okay, so this is probably like a boom mic, so hopefully this is better. Okay, so I wanted to give some updates on admission webhook server that we have been working slowly and steadily. So first of all, we have like staging builds set up, which are automated. So for every commit to our mainline development branch, the builds are tagged appropriately and pushed. So that's you can see the console.cloud.google.com. Rob, if you can click that link, maybe just to show how it looks like. So we only have admission server, I think, in here right now, but we probably, if we have more assets in future, then we can have that as well. I have a pull request out right now to tag this, to introduce a latest tag here so that it's easy for maintainers and even users to use like the latest and the greatest from the development branch here. Rob, if you can go back. So that's that. Definitely play with it and see if you spot some issues. And feedback is welcome before we push it out more. The next thing is we have a lot of comments in our repository where we are like, okay, we should introduce validation in the webhook for this, right? We will have a validation webhook. So next time if you see one, if you can create a GitHub issue to track that sort of things, that would be good. Uh, we can go and audit it, but I think it's a pretty cumbersome exercise. So yeah, and then thanks, Rob. This is also a good area for have to get contributions, because implementing a validation logic has, it's self-contained. Finding contributors to contribute to the API sometimes has a much higher sort of, you know, effort that contributors need to put in. So That's another reason to do it. Another thing that I wanted to quickly run by was, Rob, if you can click that link to the webhook YAML, so we have this images to do right now. And what I was thinking was if we should link this to the latest image of the staging repository. And then whenever we have a release, before the release, we tag it to the release version appropriately. That's one option, or the second option is to tag it, like, keep it tagged to the latest production image. So, the next time we have a release in this repository, uh, we tag it appropriately inside, like the admission server Docker image gets tagged with the same version, and that's what we reference here. So should it be like latest of the master branch, or should it be tagged to the last GA build?
I think for now it makes sense to pin to latest because we don't really have a good alternative. And we anticipate, or at least it feels like this is going to continue to be developing at a relatively rapid pace. So limiting it to, VO.3.0 or VO.4.0 may be too constraining. On the other hand, I think we will want to have tagged versions as this becomes more stable. So I don't know if that's O.4.0, O.5.0. I mean, I think that this is still in an alpha state. Our project, that our APIs, our webhook, I'd say everything is an alpha state. But as we start to get more stability, I think we would want to switch. But until then, it seems appropriate to pin at latest.
Yeah, I would think when we cut a release of the APIs that we cut the image and bake that image version into line 69.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully we can have things be more stable as part of our O.4 release, our V1 Alpha 2 release. But until then, pinning to latest seems reasonable.
Sounds good. Any other comments on that? Okay. Yeah, I think that there's that, and I think so we can do that. And yeah, I think that's all the updates I had on that side. We Once we have that flow going, we'll have to figure out how to get the webhook installed for our users, like once there is enough stability by default, right? So that right now the install, I think make install is for us, but how do we encourage implementers and users to install the webhook? Because that's the only way we can have a sane enough, or not a sane, but a good enough user experience right now.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, no, thanks a bunch for leading this work. I'm glad to see this working already, and will be great to have this final step in place. So I think you had a related PR to add the latest tag. Is that on the Gateway repo, or is that on? Okay, all right.
It's on the Gateway repo. Yeah.
Cool. I will try and take a look at that soon. Yeah, let's move into V1 Alpha 2. I think a lot of discussion today is going to be around this. I really wanted to run through what's already in the milestone, try and prioritize it, and then also make sure that we had it scoped properly. We hadn't missed any things that we want to cover in this, and then also cover my initial PR, which would start the transition to V1 Alpha 2. I think that this is a pivotal or critical part of this API development process. As we're seeing with Gateway API at KubeCon and all the associated blog posts, whatever else there is, this API is starting to get significantly more attention. And that's great, but it means that we're running into this place where we have a relatively limited window where we can really make breaking changes. And as long as we're alpha, we technically can make breaking changes, but the more and more people, the more and more implementations that are based on this API, the more costly those breaking changes will be. So this is a really critical point. I think we want to try to make sure that we get things in as good of a state as we possibly can with this V1 Alpha 2 release, because breaking changes after this point will be increasingly costly. So that's the way I'm viewing this release. I really want to make sure we're focusing on things that we didn't get right the first time, or that we see room for improvement on, that may be breaking changes, and try to get those out. You know, there's other things which I would classify as more additive functionality that are good to have, but may not be as required from my perspective, because really the reason we're making this V1 Alpha 2 instead of just another iterative update to V1 Alpha 1 is because we want to make some of those breaking changes. So from my perspective, that should be the focus of our next 2 months, or however long it takes to get this release out. So yeah, that's my perspective on this release. Let's run into this PR that I have that restructures the repo to support V1 Alpha 2. This makes a couple assumptions, and I wanted to get some broader feedback if these assumptions are reasonable. But basically what it does is it copies the entire V1 Alpha 1 API and puts it as the start of the V1 Alpha 2 API. It adds a note to the top of the README to say that V1 Alpha 2 is not supported, it's not stable, it is under active development, etc. But I think it makes sense to continue working in the same form we have before, just on the main branch. But again, make it clear that this is not actually released yet until we cut a release with V1 Alpha 2. The other change I've made that's very related to that is I've copied the entirety of the docs and added a new V1 Alpha 2 directory where we can put all our existing docs, just and any docs updates. And at some point we can take, you know, when we release V1 Alpha 2, that can become the primary docs. But until then, what you're going to see is you're going to see, you know, gateway API.sigs, you know, whatever, /V1 Alpha 2 gets you all the V1 Alpha 2 updates, but the main docs site continues to be focused on V1 Alpha 1. And when we release V1 Alpha 2, we can switch and have, you know, a reference to V1 Alpha 1 potentially in the same style, but focus on V1 Alpha 2 docs. Does this style make sense?
Question. So will we still continue to push updates like to docs in V1 Alpha 1, and then we'll have to reconcile that, or do we like yeah, that's
Yeah, so
gonna be a problem.
that's a good question. The reason I wanted to separate these is because I think it's possible or likely that we still have typos or confusing concepts in V1 Alpha 1. So I want to be able to continue to update those. But at the same time, I recognize that as we're adding features to V1 Alpha 2, we should expect that docs for those features or changes should go along with V1, with those changes as they get checked in. And so you would make those changes in the V1 Alpha 2 docs. And if you are fixing typos or anything else, they would probably apply to both docs. This feels a little bit cumbersome, but I don't know of a better way to do that.
Yeah, replicating the entire docs just for V1 Alpha 2 seems a bit heavyweight. I'm just kind of cruising through the docs really quick, and it seems like, you know, everything should stay the same besides references. And I wonder if the references section under API spec that we can't have just two subdirectories there, one for alpha 1 and one for alpha 2.
So so one of my concerns is that there are other areas like say gateway and route where we may start changing diagram. Like let's say, one of my goals is to adjust, tweak how gateways and routes are bound together. So you could see that starting to come into areas like security model, like these API types, and then even these guides. So you're really starting to get into a place where lots of things are potentially changing. And although
Yeah.
I'd love to,
It's heavyweight if we are going to be updating both. But if we don't think V1 Alpha 1 will be updated except for little tiny bug fixes,
yeah,
then it's just archive. I think it's fine. If we start mixing versions with references, my concern is that someone will get very confused at some point, and then the docs will actually be inaccurate because they'll be pointing to the wrong version.
Yeah. Rob, as you're kind of going through this, it's like, yeah, I could see that users would start to be confused as, maybe the model changes, different resources are added, and we're constantly having to scatter throughout the docs.
Yeah.
This is applicable for alpha 1, while this is applicable for alpha 2. So maybe it is just clean separation to take the approach that you're suggesting in your PR.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. And that was one of my concerns too, was the in between, like before we've released V1 Alpha 2, if we start to have some V1 Alpha 2 references in these docs that are visible to users, that's going to get confusing. That wait, there's a V1 Alpha 2, how do I use that? No, you shouldn't use that, but we have it in the docs, or the alternative is we wait until we release to add all the docs, and that's also not great. So this just kind of hides it away, and if you know how to get there, you can, but it's not explicitly linked anywhere. So not perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll let you complete.
No. I think this is not a perfect solution, but maybe the least bad one.
Yeah, another solution that comes to mind for this is using a Git branch to keep all the activity of V1 Alpha 2, and then do a merge of whatever we have in the main branch. The cons with that is you have to do some additional setup to do like web doc site preview, like something like V1 Alpha 2 .gateway api.6.kats.io, something like that. So that's a little bit more work. But that also gives you a good linear history. Not linear. It gives you a good Git history. So that is one way. Another way to do it, but it requires some tweaks in how we use our tooling. I think maybe CI tweaks and Netlify.
Yeah, that's definitely something I'd considered. I think that would be good in many ways. I was concerned about the CI changes that would be required and the infra changes, specifically like how do we decide that it's time to merge everything in V1 Alpha 2 back into main and release. It complicates that final release process and everything in between, especially if we do make updates to typos or whatever in V1 Alpha 1 docs, how we resolve any conflicts. I don't think this is the end of the world. That almost feels a bit cleaner to have a separate branch, but also more complicated. I don't feel strongly. I see the positives of that.
I think if we can agree that we'll focus on V1 Alpha 2, and V1 Alpha 1 is like mostly just frozen except for some minor bug fixes, and we expect maybe less than 25 commits, let's say. 20, like
Yeah.
that's also pretty high. Then I think we can, do a little.
Harry, just a FYI, your audio is extremely low in volume.
How about now?
That's better.
Yeah, that's
Thanks.
better.
Okay, so I mean, if we can just agree that V1 alpha 1 is mostly frozen and we'll only send, like maybe have a very few number of commits, single digits, or maybe very low number of double digit commits, then we can have a little bit of manual toil to sort of merge the two things together. So I think that's good. What another question I had, Rob, was did you what are you also generating V1 alpha 2 CRDs as part of it in a separate directory or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that would need to be, so, okay, that's a good point. So it's actually, they're all going to the same directory. It's a single CRD that includes both versions. If I remember correctly with how this is generated, that's what we will need whenever we release this. But it does mean that if anyone is installing CRDs from, head, from master, they're going to get this extra API version, which we do not want. Everywhere we've referenced installing CRDs is very much from a tag. So, all our examples are at vo.3.0. So if people are using that, that's okay. But if someone installs CRDs from master and we're using this approach, that is going to be a bad experience. Well, a confusing experience. So that's a good argument for a separate branch.
I mean, are any of the implementers here using like untagged version to pull and perform like make install?
We just deploy off the URL, like an example docs.
Yeah, so O.3.0.
Yeah, against the tag.
Yeah. So I think that's what everyone is doing. It's just if someone installs their own CRDs and their way of doing it is just, I don't know. It's an edge case, but it's possible with this approach.
Do we need to version the admission webhook as well differently for each version now?
That's a good question. There's been an OSS issue that Harry started, this one, where there's been some good conversation around that. And I'll defer to that, but that is a key question in all of this, how we do versioning. But yeah. Okay, well, I think the action item I'm getting out of this is I should at least look into the infra required to run on a separate branch here, and what that looks like for Netlify, what that looks like for other components. And I'll try to follow up on this PR with how complicated or not that is. And then we can make a decision as far as how we want to go forward. Whether it's a separate branch or whatever it happens to be.
I'm leaning to just keeping it what we have. If it turns out to be even little more complicated, it's better to do this way because we are very familiar with this workflow.
Yeah.
So that has advantages too.
That makes sense. Anyone else have a preference on this?
No, I've seen it done both ways. I know I've seen
Yeah.
it before. So yeah, I think having them both in the same repo is fine. We do that in other projects as well. And there's not much impact on the older versions usually. Short of usually the older version is the one that gets tagged or shown first in the docs. So when you do update something, you update there just so that when you just go to it first, they see the updated version if it's across versions. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, if anyone has time to take a look at this, I left a hold on it just because I wanted to have a broader discussion. But maybe I'll pull that hold off and we can get this in sooner than later, because I think everything is kind of everything related to V1 Alpha 2 is blocked on this or some version of this.
I want to make sure I understand the point that Harry was making about a different approach of just cutting a different branch for Alpha 2. So with that approach, the benefit of that is if implementers need to use a non-release version of Gateway API. Is my understanding correct? I guess I missed that part of the conversation.
I think there's a few advantages. I hadn't thought of that one though. Maybe Harry, is that one you were thinking of?
No, I hadn't thought of that either.
Okay.
So in the current implementation, how would implementers pull the latest non-released version?
I feel like this would be pretty easy to pull the latest non-release version, assuming we're not going to be making any changes to V1 Alpha 1, any API changes that is, then the latest version is going to be the same, whether it's on the main branch here or on a V1 Alpha 2 branch. It's going to look the same. It's just whether you're referencing the main branch or V1 Alpha 2 branch, I think.
Rob, is there another project that we could reference as prior art?
Yeah,
How to deal with
yeah. Let
this?
me take a look to see what others are doing here. It's somewhat. I spent some time as I was working on the code gen to make this work, looking at prior art, and there's a surprisingly limited number of CRD based projects that have really gone through many additional versions. A lot of them, V1 Alpha 1, and I mean there are more, but there's not a lot that are generating multiple versions of the same CRD at the same time in the K6 thing. But I'll take a look at a few. I think Cluster API is always a good reference, and they've gone through. I think they're on their 4th alpha now. So it's helpful to see what they've done, but of course they have some different workflows and but helpful to look at them as a comparison.
Yeah, if you can take a look at that, maybe add a comment to this PR.
Yeah, I think my follow-ups from this are just to explore briefly what branching would look like. I see there are some advantages to it, and so I want to at least test it out, and then also to see what others have done here. I'll follow up later today. Cool. Well, I don't want to spend too long on this, but hopefully we can get this in sometime in the next week. I'll ping people once I have a better idea of where we should head with this. But this initial round of feedback has been really helpful. Let me move on to the milestone itself, and we can run through what we currently have in here, and maybe we can take a stab at prioritizing these things again. HTTP redirects. Any thought on one, if this belongs in the milestone, and if it does, what priority we should give it?
How are we recording it? Oh, we have labels, Rob?
Yeah. Traditionally, what we've done with this is we've done soon is nice to have, important is long-term is really not critical, but it would be cool, and critical urgent is really a blocking. We would block this release if we didn't get it in. So we basically have 3 levels that we're using here.
Yeah, I think we
So-
should add this.
Okay.
And
Do you-
probably
I-
probably soon is good.
Okay. All right, let's move on to controller immutability is not enforced. This is a webhook one. I think this would be really great to have. I'd say this could also be soon. Any?
Go ahead and assign that to me as well.
Okay. Oh, that's cool. All right, add success reasons for conditions. I feel like this is a good idea, but nothing that absolutely needs to get in to V1 Alpha 2, the initial release, because what we've described as conditions as are really just a baseline that any implementation can choose to extend and add their own. So it's a nice thing for consistency across implementations, but it doesn't feel like it is absolutely critical to me. So for this one, I would lean towards long-term. Does anyone would prefer soon or something else? Okay. Okay, so route to route delegation. How, if we do route to route delegation, it's going to be a large breaking change. How do we feel about that concept?
So Rob, like, probably we should, I don't know if priority makes sense for the big topics.
Okay.
Like basically each release should tackle, we can come up with some number of like big topics, like 3, like basically a few, but big. And then triaging it, like the rest that are like very specific, like do X, like add, redirect, or like those, I think then those make sense to prioritize, because those are just kind of one-offs that can just go.
Yeah, I think you're right. So these issues aren't really necessarily one-to-one with those big issues, but in a separate list here, I've kind of highlighted what I think are the big highest concern issues for V1 Alpha 1 or V1 Alpha 2. And I think that at least the first 3 of these represent breaking changes that are large in scope, that if we want to do them, this is the time to do them. So like going back to that initial thing I said, like this is our time to break things if we need to. So things like the gateway route binding that we've discussed, and there's a couple issues, docs, etc. around this. Route delegation, this has been kind of like this high level thing that has existed in concept since the beginning of the API. We just have never actually implemented it. We got a feature request more recently for it. And then the cross namespace forwarding is kind of overlapping with this. Like I think this issue kind of was that feature request where they wanted to delegate paths to different namespaces.
Yeah, like my take on how to handle this is basically these are mostly bound on like we actually need a full session to discuss it, probably like 2 or 3 sessions. And then in terms of looking at the next milestone, we should be like, okay, if the next milestone is in 2 months, as suggested here, how many meetings do we have? Schedule these big topics, and then the medium ones as I described in the previous category, we will basically handle as like just continual
Yeah.
kind of like triage, issue triage. That's my suggestion, because these require pre-work,
Yeah, they
probably
do.
like
Yeah.
intro session,
Yeah.
more work, another session, right? Like,
Yeah, so realistically, we have maybe 7, and again, it's hard to get the correct order of operations in here. I threw out 2 months as kind of a ideal timeline to get another release out. Maybe that's too optimistic. I don't know. I like we don't. I'm interested in what people think about that. But before we really got into timeline, I also wanted to understand the scope of this release. And it's hard to, it's hard to get, a true understanding of how quickly we could possibly do this without first understanding scope. So even if we don't want to do every one of these things, if we want to at least dedicate time to exploring it, dedicate at least one meeting to, say, this thing, the gateway route binding, or another meeting to route delegation. If these are really topics we want to investigate further, then I think that helps inform what our timeline should be here. And I'm mostly interested in, are there additional things that I'm missing from this list? I tried to run through issues. I added some to the milestone, but I feel like there may have been things I missed that are large in scope.
yeah, that's like a call to action for the full group.
Yeah.
The one thing that comes to mind, I don't recall what the issue is offhand, but is I see that first bullet point of reworking gateway to route binding. Also interested in making gateway class optional as opposed to required.
Yeah. That would be a significant breaking change. Yeah. Good call. So, and specific to optional gateway class, is that to drive namespace scope implementations, or is that to simplify deployment of any implementation?
Simplify.
Okay. Okay, so that's, yeah, I know there's an issue and there was a PR that got closed, but this would be worth following up on. Are there any other kind of big topics like this that people are aware of? Or even if they're not well-defined, things in the API that we found frustrating to work with and want to improve?
Rob, let's ping on Slack and send out an email.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
try to make it as broad as possible. And
yeah,
then
for
we
sure.
can constrain it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I do plan on sending this to a wider audience as well, but just while we're here, if there's any additional concepts, it'd be great to get them out. What I'm seeing right now is a scope that feels theoretically possible in, say, a 2-month window. But I'm interested in how others feel about this, as far as timing. We don't, and I'm not saying we should commit to a firm release date for V1 Alpha 2 right now. I just want to get a rough idea of how soon we want to get another release out. My real goal is to avoid going longer than, say, 3 months without a release. I want to have a relatively consistent release cycle. And so far, our releases have been 2 to 3 months apart. And if we can keep that up, I think that would be great.
I think, like Rob, probably, let's say we benchmark on like two months, then we would have 8 meetings, right?
Yeah.
So then that sounds like to me that would be 2 major topics, or 2.5.
Well, so the thing is, we can always add things. We like policy attachment is an example of something that is primarily additive, although it's large. So it doesn't absolutely have to happen in V1 Alpha 2. But there are a number of things like, say, optional gateway class, cross namespace, route delegation, gateway route relationship. If we want any of those to happen, they're breaking changes. And so they absolutely would need to happen in the scope of V1 Alpha 2, like this initial V1 Alpha 2 release. And so that's really what I'm trying to understand. And if we have that many large topics, then maybe what you're saying, Bowie, is 2 months is too optimistic.
Yeah, we just have to pick one. Like 2 months, then we have basically 8 meetings to resolve 2
Yeah.
big topics, 2.5 big topics. We add another month, probably we can get another one. Almost it's like we just need to make a decision.
Yeah. Okay.
The other thing is, like, let's say the contributing factor there would be for the implementers. If we had more releases, is that a problem versus having a bigger release that's less frequent?
So
Like we could even just do like every month, but then at that point people are just always struggling to catch up.
by more releases, do you mean more API versions even? So like V1 Alpha 3?
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
it's, I think the biggest factor is going to be people struggling to catch up.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think having more number of API versions is certain. Like it can cause fatigue from an end user perspective. So we have to be careful there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would prefer to limit the number of unique API versions, even if I think it's been okay, and I'm open to feedback on this. I think our gradual intermittent releases on top of an API version have worked reasonably well, but I open to feedback on that. But where possible, I'd love to limit the number of new API versions we have. Cool. Okay. It looks like there's plenty of follow-up to do here. One of the things that I think Bowie had mentioned and I've been thinking about as well is if we can start sketching some of these out and dedicating meeting time to these specific bigger picture topics. I would prefer to prioritize breaking changes in this release cycle. So that makes me think of, this gateway route relationship, this route delegation, cross namespace forwarding, etc. These are just ideas. Maybe I think it can probably be in this doc somewhere, but maybe we can just sketch out, upcoming meetings and the key topics or themes we want to cover in those meetings. And also it would be helpful, maybe we can get some volunteers to kind of present or take on some of these bigger picture items. I don't know, are any of these specific topics interesting to anyone here? Or something that someone wants to dig a bit further into?
The optional gateway class stuff, I could
Okay,
take lead on that.
that'd be awesome. Cool.
But I guess at this point, I don't understand what I would need to do. So is it to kind of just formalize the idea of making gateway class optional, creating a kind of design doc that talks
Yeah.
through the why and the changes and so forth?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to look at what. So obviously, I had made an initial attempt to do this, and that ended up failing for a variety of good reasons. And so I guess documenting why that wasn't the right approach, and then trying to come up with an approach that really addressed those core issues. I sketched something out as a follow-up. I can share this with you, but I just, this is not formal anyway, but I was just trying to brainstorm ideas around this about, like, do we need a namespace gateway class, or do we need, what other things, or do we just need no gateway class at all? And so I have some like notes that I've been thinking about here, but they're really nothing more than a starting point. But I think just learning from the imperfections of the first attempt here, and hopefully finding something that is more appealing would be, yeah, so like a doc, I guess, and some kind of proposal.
Okay, well, yeah, if you go ahead and put my name next to that, and then if you could do me a favor and just XREF that doc or those notes that you're talking about. So maybe under these biggest items, we've got bullets of the items, maybe just to go ahead and talk through, make a sub bullet that just says, okay, this is the approach we're going to take, have people put their name next to each item, and then we're going to have dates where each person is going to present their proposal, yada yada yada.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think this is one of the most well-established concepts, because we've already had meetings around this, and there's already a doc, there's already an issue. I'm open to starting with this one because we're probably furthest along in discussion around this. So in lieu of anything else, I'm tempted to just add this as the first item we discuss. So on May 10, and then we can keep on. And I'll try and throw this into a table at the top, and then it's kind of just as things become available. But we can pencil things in before then. Yeah. And obviously, the sooner docs are available, the sooner we can start discussing these things, the better it is. We definitely don't want to be starting discussion. Like, let's say we're releasing this, or hoping to release this in 2 months. We don't want to be starting discussion about a big topic a week before that. Like we really want to have those discussions started fairly early on in the cycle. So, okay. Cool. I'll take some time to organize this and throw it in a table at the top, and hopefully that'll put us on a good track here.
Yeah, and if those biggest items really are what we're going to try to tackle, it seems like 2 months is pretty aggressive, in my opinion.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. So, this
maybe we
is,
just try to target, 3 months is, I think,
yeah,
going to be challenging enough.
yeah. Yeah, that's probably accurate. Okay. Okay. That makes sense. All right, we've got a bit of time left here. Was there anything else that we should? I don't think we're in any place to really talk about beta yet. But I would love to get to a point where we could release beta sometime in 2021. But that's so far out right now. Yeah.
It does help. Like, do we think after V1 Alpha 2 that the next milestone should be a beta? Given that,
So
like, one of the requirements is like we have several implementations, and that is satisfied. Maybe we should come up with
Yeah.
some kind of crib sheet for how
So
to evaluate beta-ness.
I think,
Yeah, and Bowie, I
you
think
know,
you're getting to my question that I have highlighted there that I sent to Rob is like, you know, let's just identify what the benchmarks are for getting to
Yeah.
beta.
yeah, that's fair, because we want to get to beta so we can really offer stable implementations on this API. But at the same time, we need to get the API right before we get to beta, because once you get to beta, you really lose a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can change, which is both a good thing and also a frustrating thing. So I think we should treat V1 Alpha 2 as if our next release is V1 Beta 1. So try to get it as good, perfect as possible, with the assumption that there is no more room to make breaking changes. And try to fit as much as we possibly can in as far as those breaking changes, and really test out our theories. I want to really make sure that we're getting upstream Kubernetes API reviewers involved in this process as well, to ensure that the API decisions we're making here would also make sense in upstream Kubernetes. And like Danny and like Bowie are saying, having some kind of core requirements and set forward some benchmarks for what it takes to get to beta graduation would be really important.
Yeah, and if we're saying beta, we really don't want to make breaking changes afterwards. I think those benchmarks need to be pretty high, and I call it the maturity of the implementations, right? Because we're seeing the implementations out there, but how mature are they, right? Obviously, they're not mature at all. How many of the implementations are conformant? Probably none. So that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about with maturity, which is great that we have the implementations are where they are, but they still have a long way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe building off of that, we need N conformant implementations of the API to graduate to beta, or as one of the requirements. Which obviously means we need conformance tests, but okay, that's a good follow-up here. All right, well, I don't want to spend too much longer on this. I know there's a couple items left on the agenda. Thanks to all the feedback here. If you have time, interest, capacity, if you want to sign up for one of these bigger items, that's great. But also remember that there are a number of smaller items that are relatively easy to pull off of this milestone. Maybe we can run through and label some of those that are on the smaller side of scope here. And if you're looking to contribute, this is a good place as well.
And there's also just issues not in the milestone. If people want to just crawl through them and throw them in the milestone, if it's like a one-off, very small thing that can be done.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Harry, I think this one's yours. Yes, our versioning discussion. Maybe you want to give a bit of background on this?
Yeah, so right now we have an API version which is specific to our Kubernetes CRDs, and then we have a version for this repository, right? So the code we release as part of like the Go code, essentially, I think. And they two are tied together, really. So if when we will be doing V1 Alpha 2, we'll be doing it as V0.4.0. Now with admission webhook, there is a Docker image that needs to be tagged appropriately. So the question is, how do we tag it, right? And there's one proposal where we tag it based on the version of the repository that we have. So the next release will be V0.4, then we'll tag it the Docker image of the admission webhook at that point to v.o.4. Now, there are a couple of things, right? Like what happens if you need to push out an admission webhook, but you don't have enough updates on the other areas. I think Rob mentions that in his comment, and that we could have updates in one of the areas of this project. So that could be API, that could be um, like backward, like new functionality, backwards compatible updates, or introduction of new API versions, right? So, and that those could be the reasons of release of this, to create a release in this repository. So I wanted to know, like run this by here and hopefully come to a decision of what do we think should be the versioning strategy for the Docker image of the validating webhook server.
Yeah, and my hope here was that we could really just copy Kubernetes upstream as closely as possible. And so if you think of Kubernetes 121 as an example, Kubernetes 121 introduced some new API versions. They introduced some changes to functionality in, say, the controllers and their tests. And they also updated iterative changes to existing API versions. So as an example, Harry added a new option for ingress class that allows it to reference namespace scoped parameters. That's, the version of the ingress API didn't actually change, but the Kubernetes version did. So this became available in Kubernetes version 121, as an example. So although I admit that versioning is not the most straightforward concept, it's at least probably going to be familiar to most people that are coming from Kubernetes and seeing Gateway API. So if we could copy that and say that we have a project version, which maps to a Kubernetes version, like similar in concept to that, and that each project version has supported API versions. And so let's say we have validating webhooks and conformance tests that are part of the project. They support whatever API versions are included in that release of the project. And that's just how it works. That may be too simplistic. We may at some point need to have separate versioning for the webhook and separate versioning for conformance tests and separate versioning for everything else. But I would rather keep kind of this unified project version that is in line with supported API versions as long as we can, because I think that's maybe a little bit easier to understand. But this is just my perspective on this, and I'm really open to what others think here. And
I think that makes sense.
So as the API becomes more stable, less releases. So just trying to understand like the use case where there's like a bug in the webhook server, and now you've got to wait this extended period of time to get the next release of that, right?
so, yeah, that's a good clarification. What I'm describing here is a release that does not require API changes. So as we get more components that are not necessarily API, we could have, so far we've just done minor version updates, but at some point we're going to have patch version updates for software included in this project, like Kubernetes Upstream does. So in that case, I think you'd have let's say we were in 0.6.0 and we had a bug in our webhook or our conformance test, we do 0.6.1 and API wouldn't change at all.
Yeah.
We just have a fix to webhook or whatever it happened to be.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Okay. Cool. I know we're past time here, but if anyone else has thoughts, feel free to add them as comments. And I'll try and follow up. I've got a few things to follow up both on this PR and also trying to structure this out and plan some meetings in advance. A reminder that based on discussion today, we're going to switch our meeting times effective next week. So instead of seeing you on Wednesday, Monday, May 10, if you happen to be in Pacific time, that'd be at 3 p.m. and go from there. But thanks everyone for the great feedback and great discussion here.
Thanks. Bye.
See you.